1968. I'll just introduce our speakers in reverse order, because that's the order I wrote them down in. They're going to be speaking of the order. First of all, there's David Morgan, who's the Secretary of the Socialist History Society, and something I didn't know until pretty recently, an avid collector of rare leftist sectariana, it seems. Mark Hobbs, one of my colleagues at UEA, who's recently completed a PhD on, well, of course,
in British far right.
Right, on the British far right, and Nicolas Helm-Grovas, a PhD student at Royal Holloway University of London, and your PhD subject is?
It's about Peter Wollen.
It is about Peter Wollen. Excellent.
What?
And Royal.
What?
Peter Wollen.
Peter Wollen.
The film critic.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, and so without further ado, I'd like to ask them in reverse order to make their presentation. Nicholas.
Yeah, so my PhD's on Peter Wollen and Laura Mulvey, but I'm speaking about Wollen today. I was supposed to be on the first panel, and I think it would have sat quite well in there. The paper is called Early Wollen, Cultural Politics in New Left Review, 1963 to 1968. So the kind of, the paper was really kind of, so I mean, just to introduce Wollen, for those of you who don't know him, he's a film critic. His most famous work is probably from the 1970s. So there's texts like The Two Avant-Gardes, which some people may know. There's one on Godard called Godard and Counter Cinema. He wrote a book called Signs and Meaning in the Cinema in 1969, which is quite important as well. He was associated with the journal Screen. Many of you know that. He was on the editorial board. But what I try to do in this paper is to, I talk about his writings for New Left Review in the 1960s, which preceded that more famous stuff. And I try to kind of map it onto three kind of broad tendencies in the NLR in the 1960s. So a kind of disparagement of native cultural resources in Britain, so a kind of criticism of that, a turn towards foreign sources. In his case, it's to kind of Hollywood cinema, so a particular kind of foreign culture, but also to Europe, to France particularly, for kind of critical models and for theory. And finally, his kind of, if you like, to be a bit productive, like the intellectualism of his approach, the focus on ideas, which can be read again in the context of NLR as a whole. So, kind of assuming that maybe most people haven't had the chance to read the paper, I don't know. I'm just going to kind of draw out a few of the issues and add a few comments, but try and also just explain things for those of you who haven't read it. But I suppose the first thing I really want to emphasise is the kind of politics of Wollen's kind of cinephilia. So what I mean by that is a kind of obsessive love of kind of Hollywood cinema, and it's particularly based on a kind of a canon that comes from France, from French film criticism of the 1950s. So there's a kind of celebration of Hollywood, and one of the things I talk about in the paper is his very first text in New Left Review in 1963, which is an attack on Penelope Houston, who was the editor of Sight and Sound at this point. So, I mean, Sight and Sound kind of still, but particularly at this point, represents kind of a sort of middle-class good taste in the field of film. So his decision to focus on her and to write his first pieces of polemic is quite important. I should just say maybe, before going on to that, his kind of involvement in New Left Review comes from, I mean, we were talking before about the sort of centricness of some of the scholarship on the New Left in Britain, and I mean, in a way this is very London-centric. I mean, Wollen sort of represents maybe that specific part of the New Left. He got involved with New Left Review because he knew Harry Anderson from Oxford. They kind of knew each other when they were students, and he asked him to get involved. And then so Wollen he joined the editorial board in 1963. And he was also editor of the section that was called Motifs, which was brought in after Perry Anderson became editor. So there was a special section towards the back which focused on culture. And that was where you had writing, for example, on jazz, on kind of contemporary composition, and on film. And that's where, for example, a bit later, I think in '68, in the late '60s, you had Perry Anderson's sort of pseudonymous piece on the Rolling Stones. And Wollen himself was writing under a pseudonym at this time, which I kind of go into at length in the paper, a pseudonym called Lee Russell for film. And it's kind of various complicated reasons, but what the overarching reason was that he was kind of dodging the draft, basically. And he had kind of left the UK after being a student. He would have been one of the last people called up, I think. Graduated in '59 from university. And he kind of went abroad. But then he kind of came back to London sometimes and wanted to kind of write for the New Left Review, but didn't want to kind of face any retributions. So he was using a pseudonym, and then he was using another pseudonym, Lucian Ray, for his writings on politics, which were also being published in the New Left Review at the same time. And you might notice that obviously they have the same initials, LR, and I think there's like a few things to tease out about the pseudonyms, but one thing I think is that LR is a reference to NLR, so he's also using the same initials as the newspaper, as the journal. So maybe just to go back to this first piece specifically, but this is kind of true of just the text that he wrote in general over a period of about 5 years, because these are all a set of studies on particular directors. So the thing about this is that in context, I think it has to be seen as a kind of progressive move. This attitude to popular culture, as an attack on an ossified, snobbish middle-class culture, and as a defence of a popular art form. So that's why you have the articles on Hollywood cinema primarily, and then this attack on the editor of Sight and Sound. And so to kind of pose film as being worthy of attention. But, of course, like an attack on this kind of bourgeois, liberal, cultural establishment is not, don't suggest this is necessarily progressive in all contexts. I mean, if you look to Cahiers du Cinéma, which is this French publication that Wollen was reading and was like really determining for the film culture in Britain in the 1960s and 1970s. In the 1950s, when they're kind of elaborating this kind of canon of Hollywood cinema that Wollen takes up, the people writing there, for the most part, are leaning towards the right. And there's a group of writers there called the kind of known as the Young Turks. And all those people in this group would go on to be directors. So they're kind of huge figures in the French New Wave. So it's like Jean-Luc Godard, Francois Truffaut, Claude Chabrol, Jacques Rivette, and Eric Romer. So André Bazin was also at the magazine, but he was really kind of more on the left. But this group lent more to the right. Even Godard, who we would probably now see as like a filmmaker of the left, and had like obviously like a very militant period in the late 60s and early 70s, they were really on the right as a kind of like romantic right-wing writers. And in fact, as well, a number of these also wrote for another magazine called Arts in France, and their colleagues were this kind of group of writers known as the Hussards, who were sort of right-wing critics of the sort of establishment, sort of anti-Gaullists of the right. And also some of the other kind of figures that Wollen would kind of be somewhat allied with in film terms were also really kind of not necessarily left-wing figures. So people like Andrew Sarris or Victor Perkins. But you have a sort of objective alliance almost between someone like Wollen and some of these other kind of film critics who were clubbing together to attack this other culture. The other thing I kind of bring out to start with is that there's something similar in Wollen's claim for directors as auteurs, so authors, individual authors. So the people that he kind of writes about in his different director studies, so like John Ford, Howard Hawks, Joseph von Sternberg, Bud Boticher and Sam Fuller, who are lesser known Hollywood directors, as well as it's mostly Hollywood directors and then a couple of European directors like Rossellini, for instance. Now again, like this kind of posing the centering the kind of study around an auteur, one might see this now as not very progressive, right? Because it could be seen as a way of denying the social determinants of film, of obscuring the collective nature of film production, and of enthroning a kind of canon of great men directors, and like emphasis on men. And so with kind of Wollen's emphasis on artistry as well, he's also somewhat distant from, say, Stuart Hall and Paddy Winnell's book, Popular Arts, which came out in 1963, something like that. So around the time Wollen started working. So that book, and Wollen's kind of acknowledged its importance, that book has a section on John Ford and the Western, for example, but it's very different from Wollen's approach. Like Wollen never talks about production, it's really kind of an aesthetics of Hollywood cinema. But what I think is important then is that, you know, maybe it should be kind of grasped that it's still a prevalent idea at this time when he's writing, and common on the left as well, that popular culture and, you know, Hollywood is the kind of biggest expression of this, is kind of irretrievably fallen and kind of commodified and false consciousness sort of through and through. So the auteur, in this context, helps Wollen kind of make value judgments within popular culture to sort of sift through it. And then, interestingly, in just a few years, by the early 70s, Wollen himself is kind of launching a pretty scathing attack on the concept of authorship. So, I mean, the high point of this might be 1972. Like, by 1972, Wollen is kind of, that's the kind of high point of Wollen's kind of post-structuralism, which he's already kind of got to in 72, although a very kind of politicized version of that. And at that point, he's kind of celebrating Godard as an author who, through kind of quotations, totally gets rid of himself as an author. But what I kind of I would suggest then is that this kind of destruction of the author in the early 70s is actually kind of dependent upon the construction of the author already in the 1960s. So there has to be a kind of general consensus that the filmmaker can be a creative artist in order for it to be a kind of, in order to kind of take it down as a radical gesture in the way that one could in, say, literature, where the kind of author is assumed to begin with. There's also, and similarly around this time, Hollywood in the early 70s, I mean, Hollywood in general came under attack from Wollen and others as it came sort of increasingly to signify American imperialism through the Vietnam War and so on. So there's a kind of difference then between someone like Peter Wollen and some of the other kind of English language film critics who were also influenced by Cahiers du Cinema and the kind of the idea of the auteur, the politique des auteurs, as it's called. So these would be people like Andrew Sarris, who's worked in the United States, or in the UK, writers associated with the journal Movie, who, among other things, had like a strong sort of Levisite influence on them. Because those other critics basically always stayed true to a romantic vision of the artist as someone expressing their personality. And in someone like Andrew Sarris, I would argue it's overtly reactionary. So in his kind of famous book, the American cinema, which is a sort of encyclopedia of Hollywood film, and it has a section on, I think, a couple of hundred different directors, and it tells you like what the best films are, and it gives you like a little paragraph on each one. He puts, so after a couple of pages of male directors, he puts all the female directors in a single section called the Ladies Auxiliary. So, again, like in the 60s, we can see how Wollen might be allied with certain aspects of some of these writers, but it's really more tactical, I think. The other, another thing to bring out, I think, in relation to New Left Review and to the kind of, maybe to the New Left more generally, is the emphasis Wollen places on method. So the kind of, the politique des auteurs, this kind of use of the idea of the film author to structure criticism, is for Wollen a kind of way of increasing the rigour of film. So he doesn't like the kind of cult of the director that you find in some of this writing, but what he likes is the fact that it could be a way of approaching film criticism. And at this time as well, his big theoretical influence is Lucien Goldman. Okay. Is Lucien Goldman, so he's using Goldman to try and take the directors that he's working on, and he tries to kind of abstract an ideology from their work and then relate it to something bigger. So he's, you know, using John Ford, for example, and trying to abstract kind of Fordian ideology and relate it to American culture. It's also why he's particularly interested in the Western and the gangster film, because he thinks these have more social implications. So I kind of wonder whether here there's a kind of something we, without necessarily wanting to be reductive, we can put this into a kind of Western Marxist framework, right? Because there's a very clear concern with method. And in fact, like he often writes in his text that film criticism needs to kind of become more rigorous. I've just got a couple of minutes, I can just add a four. Well, maybe I can talk a little bit about what happened post-68 for Wollen. That might be helpful. So kind of after, you know, through this period, Wollen's work is kind of changing. So by the time we get to the mid-70s, we've seen like, we have this increasing formal radicalism. So he turns more or less entirely to the avant-garde, so away from Hollywood. Although Hollywood is still very present, his kind of theory of the avant-garde is almost like a negative or inversion of what he's talked about before. So it's still very influential, but he's moved over to this. And he also kind of becomes a filmmaker as well, with collaborating with Laura Mulvey. And these avant-garde strategies as well are justified politically. So he also becomes more, his politics becomes more revolutionary, although it's not like he's ever really actively engaged in practical politics. And his films with Laura Mulvey, as well as being kind of formally experimental, are drawing much of their content from the politics of the women's movement. So the politics of motherhood is really present in Riddles of the Sphinx from 1977, and kind of domestic labour in that as well. And then his 74 film, Pen for Solaire, is a lot about kind of the politics of representation in relation to women. So thinking about some of the stuff that was brought up earlier in some of the other talks, I mean, this stuff in the 1970s is drawing inspiration from events specifically in France in May '68, with, for example, there was something called the French right, Attaque Générale du Cinéma, so a kind of this kind of set of events in May or June '68, where all these kind of filmmakers and film technicians kind of got together for some meetings about like what a revolutionary or socialist film culture might be, and they produced all these different manifestos, and there are several of them, you can read them now. So that was hugely important, but the kind of key dates in this kind of British radical film culture that kind of grew in the 70s and was expressed as well in the Independent Filmmakers Association. This was really happening after '68. So '68 served as an inspiration, but not really that much was happening in 1968. And so there were key moments at different times. So 1971 is an important year for Screen, for instance. And 1975 is when the Independent Filmmakers Association is founded. So it's almost like in the aftermath of May '68 in France, this film culture sort of draws sustenance from that model, but it's not happening at the same time. Is that time?
Sure, it's not.
Okay.